the 111th edition of the Tour de France kicks off tomorrow. And we're starting the party a day early with a look back at every winning bike in the history of the Tour. That's right, we're going all the way back to the dusty roads and steel single speeds of 1903, and are going to trace a line from there to the modern superbikes of today. We found some pretty interesting trends and surprises while researching that we're excited to share with you. But first, a couple caveats. Number one, we at 99 Spokes are bike nerds, but not necessarily historians. So if and when I miss some facts, and I know for sure that I'm definitely going to mispronounce some names, then you can go ahead and graciously correct those down in the comments. Secondly, speaking of the comments, I'm sure all of you are ready to write down there, it's not the bikes that win the race, it's the riders, and you are 100% correct, we couldn't agree more. But instead of highlighting every single bike that's ever been raced in the Tour de France ever, we thought choosing the winning bikes would help us narrow down the list just a little bit. So without further ado, let's hop in the Wayback Machine and go all the way back to the first ever Tour de France, which took place in 1903. Which was put on as a publicity stunt by the French newspaper L'Auto to sell more papers. During the first few years, all riders participating in the Tour were required to race on one of two official bikes. And the winner of that 1903 race was Maurice Garrahan on his 40-pound or 18-kilogram La Française. This steel behemoth used a fixed gear hub, had no brakes, and rolled on wooden wheels. Maurice would have won the next year's Tour as well, if it weren't for the fact that he and the three other top riders were all caught cheating, essentially using vehicles to get themselves across the stage instead of biking. The title then went to the fifth rider to cross the line, who was Henri Cornet on a Comte, which is one of just a few manufacturers to make only one appearance on our list of winning bikes. 1905 was the first year that the Tour was won by a brand that you'll probably recognize, but likely not from cycling, and that's Peugeot. Peugeot is actually the second most successful manufacturer of the Tour, with 10 total victories and another 3 as a part of the French conglomerate La Sportive that we'll be talking about here shortly. Peugeot won back-to-back wins from 1905 to 1908, but the bike that we're going to highlight here is the one that won in 1907, which is actually the first bike to feature a coaster hub. This was a controversial solution to the rising safety concern of fast descents, in which riders on their fixed-wheel bikes removed their feet from the pedals to allow the bikes to coast at maximum speed. Opponents to the freewheel thought that they would diminish the difficulty of the race, as well as decrease some of the differences between riders and ultimately add more complexity to the bikes and lead to more of them breaking down. Peugeot's streak was broken in 1909 by Francois Faber riding an Alcyon, and it'd be Alcyon and our old friends La Francois swapping it out for the top spot until Peugeot once again found themselves on top in 1913. 1913 is also the start of what we're calling our second era of the Tour, and that's the first year that we saw someone win the race with a multi-speed setup on their bike. These systems were a far cry from modern derailleurs, which were actually banned until 1937. Instead, riders would have to dismount their bike and physically move the chain from one cog or another before hopping back on and riding away. Peugeot would win one more time in 1914 before the Tour took a brief hiatus from 1915 to 1918 due to World War I. World War I left Europe in bad shape, and many of the factories that had previously produced bicycles had been reduced to rubble. In an effort to continue professional cycling racing, many of France's biggest cycling companies bonded together under the La Sportive name. From 1919 to 1921, La Sportive sponsored over half of the pro peloton, and unsurprisingly, won each of the 3 years they entered, making them the only cycling manufacturer with a perfect record at the Tour de France. La Sportive disbanded before the 1922 race, but its subsidiary brands continued to dominate in the Tour. The first to do so was, once again, Peugeot, which was won by the 36-year-old Firmin Lambert, who still holds the title as the oldest person to ever win the general classification at the Tour de France. The next year, we saw another former La Sportive company begin its winning streak, and that was Automoto, who won 4 races in a row from 1923 to 1926. And it was a similar story from 1927 to 1929, but this time with Asselone back in the top spot. Things got a little weird in 1930 when Henri Graillon of the L'Auto newspaper banned any manufacturer teams from having their graphics on the bikes. Instead, every rider raced on a generic-looking yellow bike. So while we have a pretty good idea of who these races were won by, as far as the official records go, there are no manufacturers listed as a winner from 1930 to 1939. Despite the diminished branding opportunities during these years, there are still some pretty big technological advancements that happened. The first that we want to talk about happened in 1934, and that's when Antonin Magna became the first person to win on alloy wheels. Seeing as anything other than wood wheels were still banned at this point, he painted them to look the part. But the following years, aluminum wheels were finally allowed, and as you'd imagine, quickly swept their way through the peloton. The next big change took place in 1937, which is also the year that we're seeing starts our third era of the tour bikes, because that's the first time that derailleurs were allowed. And by derailleurs, I really should say derailleur, because only one model was legalized. The winner that year was Roger Lapébie, who rode a bike equipped with a rod-actuated 3-speed Oscar Super Champion drivetrain. It was also around the same time that we started to see some more widespread changes in bike geometry, and that came down to a couple of reasons. For one, road surfaces were getting better, material engineering was improving, and the competition was stiffening, which meant that bikes were shifting their priorities from comfort and ease of riding to power transfer and agility. This was done by shortening the length of the front and rear triangles and reducing the fork rake. The Tour de France was once again put on hold from 1940 to 1946 because of World War II. But that's not to say that cycling innovation stopped, because 1947 was another big year for the bikes. This year, the winner was Jean Robic, whose bike was equipped with the Simplex Tour de France derailleur, one of the first cable-actuated designs. A much less sophisticated design was being used by the Italians, one of which being 1948's winner, Gino Bartali, on his Legnano. This bike used Campagnolo's Cambio Corsa that required riders to reach back to two levers mounted on the seat stays, one to release the rear wheel, the other to select the required sprocket. 1949 kept things in the Italian court and was won by Fausto Coppi on his Bianchi, which just so happens to be the longest running manufacturer in the Tour de France, despite winning only 3 general classifications. 1950 was won by Ferdinand Kubler on his Fiorelli, and 1951 by Hugo Coblet on his Frejus. 1951 was another big year for drivetrain development, and the bike this year was the first to win using Campagnolo's new Grand Sport derailleur. This used what's now referred to as a parallelogram design and set the stage for just about every rear derailleur to follow. Speaking of Italians, Italian manufacturers continued to remain dominant for the next few years, and between 1952 and 1958, the top spot switched off between Stella, Bianchi, and Mercier. Compared to the rest of the Tour's history, bicycle development was relatively stagnant during the 50s, 60s, and 70s, which ironically is the thing that defines this third era in our categorization of Tour bikes. Yes, weight was starting to go down and geometry was beginning to evolve just a little bit more, but for the most part, the frames were still pretty dang similar. They all used steel tubing with steel lugs. As you'd imagine, drivetrain and brake technology was increasing during this time as well, and Campagnolo, a brand that was an underdog just the decade before, would go on to be a mainstay on almost every single pro bike for a couple decades following that time. That said, it would still take a few more years for bikes to truly progress into the modern era. So there you go, 15 years of bikes covered in about 30 seconds, and a whole lot less names for me to butcher. Now, this isn't so much bike related, but we'd be remiss not to stop our fast forwarding for just a second here in 1969 to talk about Eddie Merckx. Merckx had a nearly perfect run from 1969 through 1974 on his own Merckx branded bike, which was built by Colnago. He was only bested by Luis Ocaña on his titanium Speedwell Titanite. 1975 was a turning point for our French manufacturers, who had been pretty consistently beaten out by their foreign rivalries, most of which being Italian. And Gitane and our old friends Peugeot would go back and forth, swapping wins for almost the entire next decade. 1977 was actually the year that Peugeot would go on to win their 10th and final Tour, which, like I said earlier, still gives them the second most victories of any manufacturer. The French briefly surrendered their top spot to a brand that you'll probably recognize, Raleigh, for their first and only Tour victory in 1980, before Gitane took it back over and won for the next 4 years. Now, I don't know, I wasn't born yet, but there must have been something about all the hairspray, disco, and neon colors of the mid-80s that jump-started the cycling industry, because this would usher in the start of what I think might be some of the most interesting years of cycling. We saw massive changes in component quality, frame design, and probably most importantly, frame material. And 1986 would be the first year that the Tour would be won on a carbon fiber bike. Greg LeMond's Look KG86 used carbon fiber tubes made by TVT molded to alloy lugs. This resulted in a 16-pound or 7.3 kilogram bike, which wouldn't be unreasonable by today's standards and was absolutely monumental at the time. Lamont and his teammate Bernard Hinault were also the first two riders to win the Tour using clipless pedals, which, as you would probably guess, spread pretty quickly to the rest of the field. 1987 and 88 saw the return of steel before Le Mans once again won in 89 and 90 on a carbon TVT frame set. Also found on Le Mans' 1990 bike were the first generation of Shimano's STI or Shimano Total Integration levers that nested the shifters within the brake levers, meaning riders could now shift without removing their hands from the bars. As revolutionary as Le Mans bikes were, carbon wasn't quite yet here to stay. The next couple years would be won once again by metal bikes. Really, I should say more specifically, they should be won by Pinarello's metal bikes piloted by Miguel Indurain. 1991 through 1995 would go on to be the longest winning streak of a single athlete. And while Indurain's luck may have stopped there, Pinarello's didn't, and they'd go on to win in 96 and 97 as well. During this time, we also saw the short-lived success of alloy bikes, the first of which to win the Tour was the Pinarello Coral Light in 95 and 96, followed by the Pinarello Prince in 97 and the Bianchi Mega Pro XL in 98. Before we move too far out of the 90s, however, we of course have to mention Chris Boardman's Lotus 110, which paved the way for time trial bikes for decades to come. What I find most interesting about this era of cycling is that it's the only time that we've had so many different ideas of how to make a good bike, and so many of them end up being successful. I mean, there were alloy, steel, carbon, and even titanium bikes racing and doing quite well during this time. Not to mention, there were huge changes in geometry. And while brands like Giant, Cervelo, and Bianchi may not have been on the top of the podium, their work in this regard definitely deserves a mention. So in just over a decade, we went from this, a steel race bike with down-tube shifters and geometry inherited from the 50s, to this, a wind tunnel-shaped carbon fiber rocket ship that, in all reality, isn't all that far from the bikes you'll be seeing race next month. But, of course, we can't show that picture without at least real quick talking about what, in my opinion, is one of the darkest eras of cycling. That was Lance Armstrong's 7 recounted victories from 1999 to 2005 aboard his full carbon fiber Trek, the first of its kind. According to the official data, there's actually no winning bikes during these years. And of course, I don't want to throw all the blame at Lance. We all know he was one of many riders who had internally justified cheating as a required means to an end, but all that being said is, it's a bummer we don't have more bikes to talk about from that era. But one thing we can talk about is that in 2000, the UCI officially put a legal weight minimum of 6.8 kilograms or 15 pounds, which will also mark the start of our second to last era of this video that we're calling Marginal Gains. In a moment, we'll talk about how this new rule eventually mitigated the pursuit of all-out weight savings above anything else. But first, we have to talk about the winner of the 2006 Tour, which was Oscar Pereiro and his magnesium Pinarello Dogma. This was the first and only magnesium bike to ever win the Tour, and from here on out, it was all carbon. Like I mentioned earlier, the UCI's weight limit meant that engineers now had other places to focus their energy. Namely, these went to comfort, efficiency or power delivery, and aerodynamics. An example of this is the Trek Equinox TTX, one of the bikes Alberto Contador rode to victory in 2007. This also marked the first ever non-European bike company to officially take the win at the Tour, and it wouldn't be the last. The top spot temporarily went back to Europe, with Cervelo winning the Tour in 2008 before Trek took the win in 2009 and Specialized earned their first victory in 2010. 2009 also happened to be the first year that a SRAM-equipped bike won the Tour. Speaking of firsts, BMC would win their first and only title in 2007 on a bike raced by Cadel Evans. This was also the first Tour won with an electronic drivetrain, Shimano's Dura-Ace Di2. And while others had existed since the 90s, Shimano's Di2 was the first to be reliable enough to be widely used within the Tour, and again, first to win the Tour altogether. Next, it was time for Pinarello to make its second phenomenal run, winning every race from 2012 to 2019, giving them a total of 16 victories over the history of the Tour, more than any other manufacturer. Along the way, we saw a couple other innovations come and some come and pass. The first of which being oval chainrings. That said, despite their success, very few riders use them today. Bikes were also getting highly specified at this time, and if they didn't already have them, by now every manufacturer had a dedicated climbing bike, aero bike, time trial bike, and maybe more. Lastly, during this stretch of years, we saw disc brakes begin to make their first appearance onto bikes, and we'll talk more about those in just a little bit. 2020 kicks off our final era of the Tour, and that has been dominated by 2 riders and 2 manufacturers. And that is, of course, Tadej Pogačar aboard his Colnago and Jonas Vingegaard with Cervelo. During these last few years, we've seen a few noticeable shifts in bike design and technology. For starters, Pogačar became the first rider to win the Tour with a 12-speed cassette in 2020, despite their release a couple years earlier. 2 years later, in 2022, Vingegaard was the first rider to win the race using exclusively disc brakes. Switching to disc brakes also allowed for wider tires, and nowadays it's not uncommon to see riders using 25mm rims with anywhere from 28 to 30mm tires. One last interesting trend over the last few years has been the switch from hyper-specialized bike designs to ones designed to do just about everything. And that's happened because aero bikes have gotten progressively lighter, and light climbing bikes have gotten progressively more aerodynamic, and they've sort of met in the middle. These days, we've seen several companies drop stage-specific models altogether in favor of general-purpose bikes. And that brings us to today, and we can't wait to see who wins the 2024 race. Let us know in the comments who you think the winner is going to be, as well as what you think the next major innovations of cycling will be too. Until then, enjoy this year's Tour, and of course, remember that bikes are for everyone. Have fun out there.